Professional wrestling has long been about testing limits, pushing the boundaries of human endurance in bold attempts to astound its audience. When it comes to the precarious balance of risk and reward, we've seen wrestlers take incomprehensible risks, tempted by the great rewards of lofty compensation and fan acclaim, while endeavoring to come out of the other end of the stunt in as good a shape as possible. But sometimes the wild and woolly world of wrestling can go a little bit too beyond the pale. This was the case one night in 1995 when a particularly crazy stunt in South Philadelphia quickly turned into a volatile situation. And it could well have resulted in an even worse catastrophe. I'm Jack from Cultaholic, and this is the story of the ECW Arena Fire. Before delving into the specific events of Saturday night, October 28th, 1995, let's talk a little bit about the people involved and the roads they took to this moment. Throughout the entire year, a young, fresh-faced Tommy Dreamer was at war with inarguably his greatest professional rival, Raven. Once a stereotypically cocky, motor-mouthed bad guy, Scott Levy changed up his entire aesthetic upon arriving in ECW. Inspired in part by Patrick Swayze's portrayal of a charismatic ringleader of thieves in the movie Point Break, Levy added a sullen, kind of Generation X slant to Swayze's commanding presence. He combined these elements to become the brooding and sadistic Raven. Raven targeted Dreamer with the aid of many unquestioning followers, including the cheerily oblivious Stevie Richards and the alluring Beulah McGillicuddy, who, in story, had her advances spurned by Dreamer during their teenage years. There were also various other mercenaries that attacked Dreamer under orders from Raven, including the original Dudley Boys and the Vampire Warrior, or, the future Gangrel. Now, the big crux of this feud is that Dreamer could never beat Raven. Just when it seemed like victory was at his hand, something always happened that screwed Dreamer over, leaving him over forever against his hated rival. No matter what, Raven seemed to eternally have Dreamer's number. On August 5th of that year, Dreamer and Raven were put on opposite sides of an 8-man tag at the ECW Arena. Raven partnered with Richards, Dudley, and Big Dick Dudley to face Dreamer, the Pitbulls, and the ever-popular Cactus Jack. And once more, Dreamer had the finish line in sight, finding himself on the verge of scoring a pinfall victory over Raven, and then it happened. Out of nowhere, Cactus Jack kicked Dreamer and planted his teammate with a double-arm DDT, which inexplicably at the time allowed Raven to pin Dreamer, not only prolonging the feud, but allowing Cactus Jack a wholly unexpected heel turn. From there, Mick Foley cut some of the greatest promos of his entire career, disavowing hardcore wrestling and the bloodthirsty fans that thrived on it. He pleaded for Dreamer not to make the same mistakes he once had by trying to please these low-life fans that didn't care about his well-being, while also making salient points about pride, ego, and responsibility. Because Foley is such a gifted speaker, his talking points came off logical and well-spoken, and yet there seemed to be ulterior motives here. There was definitely a bit of a self-serving undercurrent, and with Raven not so subtly pulling Cactus Jack's strings, it was clear that Cactus didn't really care about Dreamer's well-being at all. Dreamer sustained further beatings at the hands of Raven and Cactus Jack, leading him to eventually seek out an equalizer. And this was somebody that Jack was quite familiar with because they'd shared the ring a number of times. In fact, just that August, Cactus had barely outlasted this man to win the 1995 King of the Death Matches tournament in Kawasaki, Japan. Enter Terry Funk. The hardcore legend himself had dipped in and out of ECW over the previous couple of years and was now here to not only help Dreamer even the odds against Raven and Cactus, but to, in essence, help Dreamer deprogram Cactus Jack. To make his heel turn work, Foley was now resorting to having boring, rest-hold-filled matches that were the very antithesis of his unpredictable wild man persona. If the fans booed and jeered his dogged attempts at, securing a negative star rating, then Mick believed he was doing it right. Dreamer vowed to beat the hardcore out of Cactus, and had a chance to do so at the ECW Arena on October 28th in a one-on-one main event. Preceding that main event, the October 28th ECW Arena card had been one for the ages. It was yet another eclectic event from a very eclectic group, in a year that keenly defined ECW as the best alternative to the doldrums of mainstream wrestling. The Eliminators defeated a team that sounds almost too good to be true today in the form of Taz and Scott Steiner. Conan and Rey Mysterio Jr. outlasted La Parka and Psychosis in a wild bout, which unfortunately resulted in Psychosis sustaining a nasty facial injury, splitting the flesh between his lip and nose to where he underwent plastic surgery that very same night at a local hospital. In the culmination of a months-long rivalry, Mikey Whipwreck finally dethroned ECW World Champion The Sandman, ending the 6.5-month reign of the promotion's resident anti-hero. But the Sandman did not remain beltless for long, because later that same night, TV champion Too Cold Scorpio defeated one half of the tag team champions in Rocco Rock of Public Enemy. And as per the stipulation, both men's belts were at stake, and if Scorpio won, he'd netted both the tag titles and got to choose a partner to hold them with. When a bloody Sandman prevented Johnny Grunge from making a late match save for his partner, Scorpio was then happy to bestow the second belt upon the now former ECW champion. Now notably, late in that Scorpio versus Rocco match, the Public Enemy member tried to put Scorpio through a flaming table only to miss, diving into the blaze himself. So that kind of sets the scene, and now the stage was set for the main event, Tommy Dreamer versus Cactus Jack. And Rocco Rock's rendezvous with Fire wasn't going to be the last open flame for the 1,150 ECW Arena fans that night. Fire had already come into play a handful of times in ECW that year alone. In April, Terry Funk, who was then a heel, went at Cactus Jack, then a babyface, with a flaming branding iron during a match, even sticking him a couple of times in the torso with the iron. And on October the 7th, Stevie Richards was put through a double stack of tables by Public Enemy, the bottom table set on fire for good measure. So yes, the ECW Arena fans had already seen their fair share of Fire. But given Cactus's character direction, Fire did not seem to be on his menu. In his pre-match spiel, a resolute Cactus promised the fans that they were in for the most boring match possible. Meanwhile, Tommy Dreamer, flanked by Funk, expressed determination through a very solemn glare that looked to make good on his pledge to drag the old Cactus Jack out of Foley's recesses. Clean breaks and side headlocks were the main weapons in Cactus's arsenal, as he refused to take Dreamer's bait. And then when Jack passed up on a fan's offering of a steel chair to instead give Dreamer a headlock takeover on the floor, the match officially crossed over into a distinct plane of surrealist art. It was a masterclass in how to intentionally deprive the fans of their very desires. And if all of the above wasn't enough to irk the Philly crowd, Foley hit a bullseye when he passed on dropping the patented Cactus elbow from the apron, instead cheerleading the fans by spelling out the letters WCW with his arms. Because obviously ECW fans hated WCW and everything that company stood for. And you thought Mr. McMahon was a contemptible villain. Eventually, under Raven's watchful eye, Cactus began throwing closed fists at a staggering Dreamer. Punch after punch rained down on Dreamer's face until finally Cactus ended the assault because he was claiming to have broken his hand. Therefore, he was calling the rest of the match off and wished all the fans a very good night. As referee Jim Molyneux tried to count Cactus out, Funk tried goading his rival back into the ring with fighting words, in a bit that WWE recreated between the two 11 years later on Monday Night Raw. Funk insulted Foley's wife and kids over the house mic by calling them horrible things, but none of those names could get Cactus to come back through the curtain. But when Terry Funk dared insult WCW headman Eric Bischoff, out came a fired-up Cactus looking to scrap. After the continuation of what was now a heated brawl, a blood-soaked Dreamer eked out the win over Cactus Jack. But then the post-match angle came. While the match itself was played in segments on the November 14th, 1995 edition of Hardcore TV, it cuts off abruptly just as Raven and Cactus began to attack Dreamer after the match. The fans are seen cheering somebody coming out of the entranceway, but the home viewer never sees who it is. Very little corroborating media supports what happened next. All that exists are eyewitness accounts, memories from those within this tale, and the odd still image. Dreamer was on his own following the win, as Funk had been injured by the heels shortly before the match finish and was taken to the locker room. As the Raven and Cactus beatdown of Dreamer ensued, a slightly recovered Funk came storming out of the locker room armed with a faithful prop, the flaming branding iron naturally. Funk took the weapon and struck both Raven and Cactus Jack in the abdomen, but very quickly the heels regained the upper hand. And then another weapon was introduced to the brawl, a steel chair with a piece of cloth wrapped around it. You can see the parts of the equation forming here. Those who know Mick Foley's deathmatch history will well know that this was no ordinary cloth. It was a towel soaked in kerosene that, once Raven touched it with his branding iron, went up in flames. This is known in wrestling parlance as the fire chair, and somebody was going to get cooked. Cactus went at Funk with the chair, but Dreamer sacrificed himself, taking the scalding strike across his body in what was designed to be a heroic act. Foley later noted that the angle was going swimmingly well up until this point, when he remembers Funk calling for a slight audible. Funk told Foley to raise the chair again as if to attack the 51-year-old former world champion with it. Funk would bail just as Cactus closed in on him with the unforgiving flames in hand. Funk, however, remembers it slightly differently, because in his memoirs, Funk says he never told Foley to hit him a second time with the chair, but that doesn't exactly contradict Foley's version of events. Again, Foley said that Funk told him to pick up the chair again and use it, which says nothing of Foley actually intending to make contact with Funk's body. It sounds like a bit of a miscommunication all round. Foley notes that once armed, he could see Funk bailing to the arena floor, so he opted to just miss him with his second try in what would presumably look like a very dramatic close call as Funk escaped. Wherever the truth precisely lies, Cactus Jack was making like he still had Funk in his crosshairs as he brandished the fire chair once more. With the chair raised, Foley descended upon the exiting Funk with what he considered to be a bit of a slower swing, with the intent of hitting the ropes just as Terry escaped. Instead, he watched in horror as a ball of fire flew from the chair and onto the back of Funk, who was stooped over at ringside. What had happened here then was that a portion of the flaming towel had separated from the chair on Foley's swing, the swing that was intended to miss by the way, and that torn off section of fiery cloth had landed on Funk. Foley remembers a panicked and pained Funk charging around ringside while fire billowed from his body. Briefly, Foley broke character to try to save his friend and mentor, but couldn't catch up to Funk in his agonizing dash around the ringside area. Even more horrifying in the midst of all this confusion, part of the flaming towel had somehow wound up in the front row of the audience, where one fan reportedly suffered burns to his hand as a result. If that all weren't bad enough of a calamity, bad timing was about to make things much worse. Shortly after the fire shred went over the railing, 3 ECW staff members rushed to its location with extinguishers to put it out. Just as they arrived and began spraying the containers, the lights in the arena suddenly went out. So to recap, there's a fire, staffers are filling the air with high levels of extinguishing agent, and now the building's been plunged into darkness. The reason for the lights going out was a planned angle to set up November to Remember 3 weeks later. Raven had taken a battered Dreamer and strung him up into a mock crucifixion pose in the arena's Eagle's Nest area, and the lights went out to set up the surprise as a solitary spotlight was to be pointed at Raven's heinous act. Now that spotlighted image of Raven posing beside a decimated Dreamer is the only video from the entire post-match scene that has ever been shown publicly. Whoever killed the lights clearly didn't know what was transpiring down at ringside and didn't get them back on quickly enough. When panic from both the fire and the lights going out set in, fans began hastily filing towards the available exits and managed to do so without too much in the way of escalating chaos. The worst injuries were some minor ones sustained exiting through the metal chairs in the darkness, while the Wrestling Observer noted that only 1 or 2 fans were actually hospitalized. And that's horrible, but given the circumstances, it was really fortunate that no stampede type situation occurred. As for Funk, amid the panic, he finally managed to get the flaming piece of towel off him, but the damage had been done. He suffered second-degree burns on his back and his right arm, but the pain was secondary to his rage. Back behind the curtain, a furious Funk was throwing chairs and other objects while, as Foley noted, a number of tough guy wrestlers were keeping a very safe distance. Funk's wife Vicky was there, and Foley remembers her being distraught at the sight of her husband in this uncontrollable state. Foley wasn't sure what he could do to quell his friend. When he asked Funk if he was okay, Funk threw a chair right at Foley and proceeded to curse at him for the mishap. Foley remembered that when he tried to apologize, Funk hollered at him, "You damn well ought to be sorry, you son of a bitch." Funk went off to hospital while Foley made the long drive home from Philly to New York, feeling utterly guilty about what had transpired. He even admitted that during the drive he'd at one point made up his mind about quitting the business as a result of what happened. Eventually though, he'd calmed down enough to at least chase that thought away, but the guilt remained. Unbeknownst to Foley, however, Funk had actually checked out of the hospital that night and returned to the ECW Arena, where he filmed promos for the return clash at November to Remember. The following morning, Foley left Funk a conciliatory message on his answering machine. Later that day, Funk left Foley a message in return. This time, the tone was completely different, as Funk, in what Foley described as the familiar whisper mumble that Funk speaks in, apologized to Foley for the traumatic outburst the previous night and stressed that the accident was nobody's fault. The two friends put the incident behind them. Funk had healed up and the two got set to be on opposite sides of a tag team match at the November to Remember, with Dreamer and Raven as their respective partners. While Foley and Funk quickly patched things up, the fallout continued in other areas. A hearing was held on November 9th with the Pennsylvania State Athletic Commission, and a report from the November 20th edition of The Observer stated that event promoter Ed Zahn was fired for not having a doctor present that night. Nothing else could apparently be done to the other members of ECW though, because pro wrestling was deregulated in the state a few years prior. A lawsuit was eventually filed against ECW by a fan named Raymond Schweitzer, claiming that he was burned that night at the arena and that he eventually suffered from PTSD as a result of the incident. The case went to trial in May of 2000 and was dismissed. Shortly after the incident, Heyman vowed that fire would never come into play in an ECW angle again. Now, whether or not he actually said this, it was certainly not ECW's last time using an open flame during a match or angle. As a way of making things up to the Philly fans, many of whom were understandably furious about what had happened on October 28th, Heyman brought in one of their favorites. At the November to Remember 3 weeks following the incident, he personally brought back a wrestler that had been exiled from the company 7 months earlier following a notable rift, and that man was Sabu. Just before Sabu's reintroduction, there were a few knowing murmurs in the crowd when Heyman, over the mic, politely asked his staff to dim the lights. Following Sabu's acclaimed return, the rest of the night was just as memorable. Steve Austin challenged Mikey Whipwreck for the ECW title, Mysterio won a scintillating Mexican death match over Psychosis, Taz shockingly turned heel by attacking Commissioner Todd Gordon before giving a very bitter soliloquy, and in the main event, Funk and Dreamer vanquished Raven and Cactus Jack, who wore a Dungeon of Doom t-shirt in another attempt to be the biggest WCW-loving heel that Philly had ever seen. In short, the event was definitely extreme enough by various definitions of the word, without coming close to crossing the line. But in the case of the ECW Arena Fire, that remains a cautionary tale. It's a prime example of what can happen when major risks are taken for the sake of entertainment, and what could happen when those risks go awry. The end result could have been far worse for so many people present that night in Philadelphia, and let's just all thank goodness that it wasn't.